Governor Earl Long was thrown straight into a mental asylum over a stripper. It was the biggest scandal of the era. He recklessly blew public funds to please Starr, abandoning his duties while the whole country watched in disbelief. Earl Long's tragedy is crystal clear. When lust takes over, even a political titan is just a weak man, willing to shatter his entire life for a pretty face. But the next name to walk into her bedroom was the real shocker, JFK. Even the most powerful man on the planet revealed his true colors as a man with a bizarre fetish in front of Starr. Behind closed doors, he didn't care about her face. He just stared at her legs and gave a chilling command. "You can take everything off but keep the boots on." It turns out, behind the historic handshakes, these powerful men were just kneeling and submitting to a pair of leather boots. The stifling reality of the Great Depression hangs heavy over Mingo County, West Virginia, a world you are about to enter. She was born Fanny Bell Fleming on April 10, 1932, in the unincorporated community of Wilsondale. To say the family was poor is a sterilization of history. They were destitute in a way that modern America struggles to conceptualize. This was not merely a lack of money. It was a daily grinding battle against the elements and biology. Fanny Bell was one of 11 children packed into a 4-room wooden shack that clung precariously to a hillside. The walls were thin enough to let the winter wind whistle through the cracks, and the roof was a patchwork defense against the rain that turned the yard into a slurry of mud and coal dust. Her father was a coal miner. In the hierarchy of West Virginia, this meant he was a man who sold his body and his lungs to the company store for pennies. Every morning he descended into the black throat of the earth, and every evening he returned, if he returned at all, coated in a layer of grime that scrubbing could never fully remove. The fear of a collapse, of the black damp, suffocating gas, or of the slow strangulation of black lung disease was not a distant nightmare. It was the ambient noise of their existence. For young Fanny Bell, childhood was not a time of play. It was a time of labor. By the age of 10, she was effectively a miniature adult. She helped her mother, a woman of iron will and fraying patience, manage a household that was constantly on the brink of explosion. There were always mouths to feed and never enough food. Dinner was often a pot of beans, cornbread, and wild greens scavenged from the woods. Meat was a luxury reserved for the father, whose strength was the family's only currency. In this claustrophobic world, options for a girl were brutally binary. You could marry a minor, likely by the age of 15, and begin the cycle again, churning out children, aging prematurely, and burying your husband before you were 50. Or you could vanish. Fanny Bell possessed a spirit that the crushing weight of the mountains could not flatten. She was different. Even in flour sack dresses, she carried herself with a strange, innate defiance. She saw the women of Wilsondale, worn down, teeth missing, eyes dimming before their time, and she felt a primal panic. She knew with the certainty of a prophecy that if she stayed in the hollow, she would die there, likely without ever having truly lived. The breaking point is often lost to legend, but the reality was likely a culmination of small miseries. A harsh word from a tired father, the pinch of hunger that never went away, or perhaps just the sight of a bird flying over the ridge, heading toward a horizon she had never seen. At an age when modern children are worrying about high school algebra, somewhere between 14 and 15, Fanny Bell Fleming made the terrifying decision to run. She packed a cardboard suitcase. It contained almost nothing: a spare dress, a few trinkets, and no money. She walked away from the shack, the smell of coal smoke fading behind her, and boarded a bus. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. The bus deposited her in Washington, D.C. The transition was violent. She went from the silence of the Appalachian woods to the roar of a metropolis. The buildings seemed to scrape the sky. The noise of the traffic was a physical assault. She was a child, alone in a city of wolves, but Fanny Bell had a survival instinct honed by years of scarcity. She lied about her age, a lie that would become second nature, and secured a job as a waitress at a donut shop near the bus terminal. It was grueling, anonymous work. She spent 12 hours a day on her feet serving coffee to government clerks, soldiers returning from the war, and drifters. Her hands, once stained with mountain dirt, were now chapped from dishwater. But even in a grease-stained apron, Fanny Bell was magnetic. She had blossomed early, possessing a voluptuous figure that the strict fashions of the late 1940s struggled to contain. But it wasn't just her body. It was her eyes. They held a mixture of innocence and knowing, a country cunning that disarmed men. It was in this donut shop, amidst the smell of frying dough and stale coffee, that destiny walked in. His name was Red Snyder. Snyder was a talent manager, a hustler on the fringes of show business. He wasn't a high-powered agent. He was a grinder looking for the next big thing. When he looked at the girl pouring coffee, he didn't see a waitress. He saw a diamond in the rough. He saw raw, unrefined sex appeal that could be monetized. He struck up a conversation. He told her she was too beautiful to be scrubbing tables. He told her about the clubs, the lights, the money. He painted a picture of a life where she would be the one being served, not the servant. For a girl who had slept 4 to a bed in a shack, his words were intoxicating. Snyder became her Svengali. He took Fanny Bell under his wing and began the process of deconstruction. The mountain accent had to be softened, though never fully removed, as it added an exotic charm. The walk had to be changed from a trudge to a glide, but the most important change was the name. Fanny Bell Fleming was a name for a coal miner's wife. It was too soft, too rural. Snyder looked at her, at the fire in her eyes and the ambition burning in her gut. He suggested blaze. It implied heat, danger, and uncontrollability. And Starr? That was simply where she was headed. The transformation was physical as well as psychological. Blaze dyed her hair a shade of red that did not exist in nature. It was a violent radioactive crimson that demanded attention. It became her trademark, a beacon that signaled she was not a woman to be ignored. Snyder introduced her to the world of burlesque. In the late 1940s and early 50s, burlesque was at a crossroads. It was moving away from the vaudeville comedy acts and toward the pure striptease. It was considered low art, a step above prostitution in the eyes of the moral majority, but it was also a booming industry. Blaze's first performances were terrifying. She wasn't a dancer. She had no classical training. She didn't know a plie from a pirouette. But Snyder told her the secret. They aren't looking at your feet, kid. She learned that burlesque wasn't about the removal of clothes. It was about the promise. It was about teasing the audience, making eye contact with a man in the third row and making him believe for just a second that the show was entirely for him. Blaze had a natural, earthy charisma that translated instantly to the stage. She wasn't an aloof, untouchable goddess. She was warm, she smiled, and she radiated a sense of fun. She made the men feel that she was in on the joke. By the early 1950s, she had outgrown D.C. and Snyder. She moved to Baltimore, Maryland. If D.C. was the seat of power, Baltimore was the seat of vice. The city was a gritty industrial port town, and its heart was the block, East Baltimore Street. It was a neon-lit strip of bars, strip clubs, and gambling dens. It was dangerous, loud, and alive. Blaze landed at the 2 o'clock club, known affectionately by the locals as the Deuce. It was the premier venue on the block. It was here that Blaze Starr truly ascended to the throne. She realized that to be the queen, she had to offer something no one else did. The market was flooded with pretty girls taking their clothes off. Blaze decided to bring danger into the equation. She introduced wild animals into her act. She bought a baby panther, raised it, and trained it to prowl the stage with her. The sight of the voluptuous redhead, clad in nothing but sequins, commanding a lethal predator, sent shock waves through the audience. It tapped into a primal fantasy of beauty and the beast, of danger and desire intertwining. The panther symbolized Blaze herself, sleek, beautiful, and capable of biting your hand off if you mistreated her. Then came the gimmicks. She didn't just want applause, she wanted gasps. She engineered the famous exploding couch. This was not merely a prop, it was a feat of theatrical engineering that bordered on the suicidal. Beneath a velvet chaise lounge, she installed a hidden compartment loaded with dry ice and a specific mixture of colored lighting, red and amber gels rotating over a high-intensity bulb. A powerful industrial fan, concealed in the base, had to be triggered by a tiny foot pedal. She operated blindly with her heel while maintaining her seductive pose. It required the physical precision of a bomb diffuser. If she missed the pedal, the act failed. If she hit it right, the couch erupted. Smoke would billow, orange lights would flicker, and the fans would blow her red hair wild, creating a chaotic, infernal tableau. It was a literal visualization of sexual heat that drove crowds insane, creating a collective hallucination where a woman's desire seemed to physically burn down the house. Lines wrapped around the block. Men from the shipyard stood shoulder to shoulder with judges and city councilmen, all craning their necks to see the woman who was too hot to touch. By the mid-1950s, Blaze Starr was no longer just an employee of the Deuce. She was the manager, and eventually she would become the owner. She had done the impossible. She had walked into a world designed to exploit women, learned the rules, broke them, and then bought the building. However, owning the keys to the Deuce meant she was now a landlord in a war zone. Baltimore's The Block in the 1950s and 60s was not a playground. It was a plantation of vice, and the overseers were not the police. They were men with vowels at the ends of their names and bulges under their jackets. The 2 o'clock club sat squarely in territory controlled by the organized crime syndicates that ran the East Coast. Blaze Starr's genius was her ability to be of that world without belonging to it. She navigated a complex relationship with the mob, including figures like Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago outfit. Blaze adopted a strategy of aggressive neutrality. She treated the mob bosses with the same playful, distant respect she treated the beat cop or the senator. She poured drinks for hitmen and smiled at capos, never letting them own her. There were nights when the tension in the Deuce was so thick it choked the air, with rival factions present. Blaze would often take the stage in these moments, using her performance to diffuse the violence, drawing every eye to her, forcing the men to focus on lust rather than blood. She was a lion tamer, but the lions were armed with switchblades and .38s. But the truest test of her character happened backstage in the airless, perfume-choked dressing rooms. Here, Blaze became the matriarch of a burlesque sisterhood. The girls who danced at the Deuce often came from broken homes, abusive marriages, and poverty. They were the discarded women of the 1950s. Most of them did not have happy endings. There was Candy, who drank herself to oblivion before she was 30. There was Velvet, who fell in love with a patron who beat her until she couldn't perform. Blaze was the only thing standing between these girls and total ruin. She bailed them out of jail in the middle of the night. She paid for their abortions. A dangerous, illegal, and necessary underground service in that era. She fired them when they were too high to dance, then hired them back when they got clean because she knew they had nowhere else to go. While the audience saw a sex symbol, the women backstage saw a protector. In a world that treated these women as disposable, Blaze Starr refused to let them be thrown away. She had money now. She had furs, jewelry, and a Cadillac. But she had something more dangerous. She had access. The 2 o'clock Club was the demilitarized zone of Baltimore society. It was where the politicians came to drink after passing laws on morality. Blaze saw them all. She poured their drinks, she listened to their complaints, and she kept their secrets. But Baltimore was merely the rehearsal stage for a much larger, more dangerous theater. While Blaze Starr had conquered the neon-lit underworld of the block, she was about to step into a realm where the stakes were not just ticket sales, but votes, legislation, and national reputation. The skills she honed in the 2 o'clock Club, reading men, managing egos, and projecting an illusion of availability while maintaining total control, were about to be tested against the architects of the American century. As she looked out over her kingdom of dock workers and city clerks, she had no way of knowing that her next conquest would drag her from the fringes of society into the very heart of its hypocritical power structure. While Blaze Starr was cementing her reign as the queen of the block in Baltimore, the United States was settling into a deceptive slumber. The narrative of the 1950s was one of aggressive normalcy. It was the era of Dwight D. Eisenhower, a grandfatherly figure who promised stability. It was the age of the nuclear family, the picket fence, and the Sunday sermon. But this veneer of morality was thin, brittle, and maintained by a conspiracy of silence. Nowhere was this silence louder than in the corridors of political power. To comprehend the scandal that Blaze Starr was about to ignite, one must first understand the rules of the game she was playing. In mid-century America, the relationship between the press and politicians was governed by an unwritten code known as the Gentleman's Agreement. It was a simpler, more corrupt time. Reporters drank at the same bars as the senators they covered. They accepted rides on government planes. They played poker together. And in exchange for this access, they turned a blind eye to the private vices of public men. If a senator stumbled drunk out of a brothel at 3 a.m., the reporter standing next to him didn't pull out a camera. He helped the senator into a cab. As long as a politician didn't commit a felony in broad daylight or allow his indiscretions to affect a vote on the floor, his secret life remained secret. This hypocrisy created a bifurcated reality. By day, these men stood on the steps of the Capitol, railing against communism, rock and roll, and the degradation of American values. By night, they flocked to the 2 o'clock Club, eager to pay for the very degradation they had just denounced. Blaze Starr sat at the nexus of this hypocrisy. She saw the most powerful men in the free world stripped of their pretenses. She knew which judges liked to be humiliated, which police chiefs needed to be coddled, and which city councilmen were prone to violent outbursts after too much whiskey. She held the secrets of Baltimore in her manicured hands, and she never spilled a drop. She was a vault. But in 1958, the vault was cracked open, not by a leak, but by a battering ram in a linen suit. In the humid, tangled world of Louisiana politics, the name Long was akin to royalty, or perhaps a curse. Huey the Kingfish. Long had been the populist dictator of the state, a man who challenged FDR and was assassinated in the corridors of his own capital. His younger brother, Earl Long, inherited the mantle. Earl was everything the Washington establishment was not. He was not polished. He did not speak in the clipped, transatlantic accent of the Ivy League. He was a creature of the bayou, sweaty, loud, uncouth, and brilliant. He was a three-time governor who chewed on unlit cigars, spat on the floor, and famously didn't buy suits. He bought bolts of cloth and had them cut into tents to cover his expanding frame. He was a man of the people in the most visceral sense. He fought for the poor, built hospitals, and paved roads, paying for it by squeezing the oil companies and the old money aristocracy, who viewed him as a rabid dog. By 1958, Earl was aging, his health was failing, and his mind was beginning to fray under the pressure of decades of political warfare. He was a man running out of time, desperate to feel alive. It was in this state of manic desperation that he traveled to New Orleans. He walked into the show bar on Bourbon Street, the premier burlesque venue of the South. The lights went down, the band struck up a slow, grinding rhythm, and onto the stage stepped Blaze Starr. The meeting between Earl Long and Blaze Starr was not a romance, it was a collision. Earl was sitting in the front row, surrounded by his entourage of sycophants and bodyguards. When Blaze began her routine, the red hair glowing under the spotlight, the panther prowling, the sheer unapologetic confidence of her movements, Earl was thunderstruck. Most men looked at Blaze with lust. Earl looked at her with recognition. He saw a fellow outsider. He saw someone who had clawed her way up from the dirt, just as he had fought his way up from the backwaters. He saw a vitality that he was desperately trying to reclaim. He didn't send a discreet note backstage. That wasn't the long way. He practically kicked down the dressing room door. He was loud, he was aggressive, and he was offering the world. For Blaze, the attraction was complex. Earl was decades older than her. He was physically unappealing, bloated, disheveled, and often manic. But power is a potent aphrodisiac, and Earl Long vibrated with power. Moreover, he was funny. He possessed a wicked, self-deprecating wit that charmed the girl from West Virginia. He didn't treat her like a dirty secret. He treated her like a prize he had won at the fair. Within days, the governor of Louisiana and the queen of burlesque were inseparable. This was where the gentleman's agreement shattered. A governor might have a mistress, but he was supposed to keep her in a rented apartment on the edge of town. Earl Long put Blaze Starr in the passenger seat of the governor's limousine. He took her to the governor's mansion. He paraded her through the French Quarter. He was challenging the moral foundations of the Bible Belt. Here was the leader of the state, a married man, openly consorting with a stripper. It was political suicide, but Earl didn't care. He was in love or something close to it, an obsessive, consuming infatuation. The affair went from a local whisper to a national roar when Earl decided to take Blaze on the campaign trail. Imagine the scene. It is 1959 in the Deep South. The electorate is deeply religious, conservative, and traditional. Earl Long is fighting for his political life. His stump speech involves promising free school lunches and pensions for the elderly. And standing just off stage, or sometimes sitting right there in the car, is a woman famous for setting a couch on fire with her sexuality. Earl bought her things with a reckless abandon that bordered on madness. But he didn't use his own money. He was famously cash poor, but power rich. He used the state's money. He treated the Louisiana Treasury as his personal expense account. He draped her in mink coats and strangled her wrists with diamond bracelets. He bought her a convertible, but the most telling gift was the one that spoke to their shared history of poverty. One night, drunk on whiskey and affection, Earl asked Blaze what she really needed. She didn't ask for more jewels. She thought of her mother back in that shack in Wilsondale. She told him her family was struggling. The next day, a convoy of trucks arrived at the Fleming homestead in West Virginia. They were not carrying gold. They were carrying prime livestock, cows, pigs, and chickens. purchased by the state of Louisiana. It was a surreal logistical operation. State-funded trucks navigating the winding mountain roads of Appalachia, delivering a governor's tribute to a coal miner's widow. Earl Long, the corrupt populist, was feeding her family the only way he knew how, with government pork. It was a gesture of profound, if illegal, tenderness. As the affair intensified, so did Earl's instability. The Uncle Earl who could charm a crowd was being replaced by a paranoid, raving tyrant. The stress of his failing health, combined with his unchecked consumption of alcohol and stimulants, was pushing him over the edge. He began to give speeches that lasted for hours, rambling about his enemies, his wife, and his sexual prowess. He urinated on the floor of legislative committee rooms. He got into fistfights with reporters. He was spiraling, and the only person who could calm him down was Blaze. The political establishment of Louisiana, the anti-Longs, saw their chance. They couldn't beat him at the ballot box. The poor still loved him. But they could declare him unfit. In May of 1959, the situation reached a breaking point. During a chaotic session of the legislature, Earl was screaming abuse at his opponents. His wife, Blanche Long, who had endured the humiliation of the Blaze Starr affair with simmering rage, finally acted. Conspiring with Earl's political enemies and family members, they arranged a coup. But it wasn't a political coup. It was a medical one. Earl was seized. He was physically restrained, sedated against his will, and thrown into the back of a station wagon. They drove him to a mental asylum in Galveston, Texas, and later transferred him to the state mental hospital in Mandeville, Louisiana. The governor was now a prisoner. It was here that the legend of Blaze Starr shifted from that of a gold digger to a heroine. When Earl was locked away, his friends vanished. The senators, the contractors, the people who had feasted at his table, they all ran for cover. No one wanted to be associated with the mad governor. Even his lawyers were hesitant to challenge the commitment order signed by his wife. Earl was alone in a padded room, stripped of his authority, screaming that he was the governor of Louisiana. He managed to get word out to the only person he trusted. He called Blaze. Blaze Starr could have walked away. She had the jewelry, she had the fame, and she had her club in Baltimore. Getting involved in a legal battle with the state of Louisiana was dangerous. She could have been arrested, harassed, or run out of the business. She didn't hesitate. She flew to Louisiana. She became his lifeline. She used her own money she had earned on the stage, to hire independent attorneys who weren't beholden to the Louisiana political machine. She acted as a courier, smuggling messages in and out of the hospital. She leaked stories to the press, framing Earl not as a madman, but as a victim of a political conspiracy, which, to be fair, he was. She helped orchestrate a legal strategy that was pure genius in its audacity. Earl Long, the governor, used his authority to fire the superintendent of the mental hospital and replace him with a crony who immediately declared him sane. It was a circus. It was a tragedy. It was the greatest show on earth. And standing at the center of it, wearing a tight dress and a defiant smile, was Fannie Bell Fleming. She had gone to war with the Louisiana establishment for the love of a broken old man, and she was winning. The humidity of the Louisiana bayou eventually gave way to the frigid, marble hallways of Washington, D.C. If Earl Long was the fire that forged Blaze Starr's understanding of political passion, her next chapter would be defined by ice. She was about to trade the manic, shouting love of a populist governor for the whispered, compartmentalized lust of a man who would become the most powerful figure on earth. In the summer of 1960, Earl Long was a man defying gravity. Against all odds, against the medical establishment, his own family, and the political machine, he had walked out of the mental hospital a free man. His first act was vengeance. His second was romance. He immediately launched a campaign for the U.S. House of Representatives. Term limits prevented him from running for governor again, so he set his sights on Washington. He wanted to take his brand of chaotic populism to the Capitol. Simultaneously, he initiated divorce proceedings against his wife, Blanche. He made no secret of his intentions. The moment the ink was dry on the divorce papers, he was going to marry Blaze Starr. He planned to make the stripper from Wilsondale the Mrs. Earl Long. It was a scandal that would have eclipsed anything the South had ever seen. Blaze, for her part, was ready. She loved the crazy old bastard. She saw the vulnerability beneath the bluster. They planned a life together. Earl, in his typical grandiose fashion, was already talking about the cattle they would raise and the elections they would win. But the human heart is a finite engine. Earl had pushed his red line for too long. On August 26, 1960, Earl Long won the Democratic primary for the congressional seat, which was tantamount to election in Louisiana at the time. He had done the impossible. He had won. Days later, on September 5th, he was in the hospital in Alexandria, Louisiana. He wasn't campaigning, he was dying. He had enjoyed one final meal, pork chops and biscuits, defying doctor's orders to the very end. And then his heart simply stopped. Blaze was in Baltimore when she got the news. The dream of legitimacy, of a life where she was more than a punchline or a pinup, evaporated. She was not the widow, she was just the mistress. She couldn't sit in the front row at the funeral. She couldn't accept the flag. She had to grieve in the shadows, while the wife who had committed him to an asylum played the grieving widow for the cameras. It was a brutal lesson in the limits of her power. But Blaze Starr was resilient. She wiped her tears, put on her makeup, and went back to work. The show, after all, must go on. To understand what happened next, we must rewind the clock slightly. The timeline of Blaze's life was not neat. Her relationships overlapped, blurring the lines between the eras. She had met John F. Kennedy years before Earl died, back in the late 1950s. The introduction was a moment of supreme irony, a testament to the incestuous nature of male power. It was actually Earl Long who introduced them. It happened at a high society party, the kind where the booze flowed freely and the press was politely asked to wait outside. Earl, ever the showman, wanted to show off his prize. He paraded Blaze in front of the young, handsome senator from Massachusetts. Kennedy was everything Earl was not. He was tanned, fit, and radiated a cool patrician elegance. He was New England personified. Earl, in a moment that chills the modern soul, practically offered Blaze to Kennedy for the evening. It was a feudal transaction, a lord sharing his bounty with a visiting dignitary. "You should get to know her, Jack," Earl reportedly said, with a wink that implied everything. Blaze was not a victim in her own eyes. She was a player in the game, but she noted the difference immediately. Earl looked at her with desperate need. Kennedy looked at her with the detached appreciation of a collector acquiring a rare artifact. The affair with JFK was sporadic, conducted in the shadowed margins of his ascent to the presidency. They met in luxury suites at the Mayflower Hotel in D.C. or the Roosevelt in New Orleans. If Earl Long was a storm, Kennedy was a surgical instrument. He was efficient. He was charming, yes, but there was a wall behind his eyes that no one was allowed to cross. Blaze's recollections of their time together, famously documented in her memoirs, offer a psychological profile of JFK that historians rarely touch. She detailed a specific rule of the future president. During their trysts, Kennedy insisted she keep her black velvet boots on. It is a detail that speaks volumes. Kennedy was a man whose entire life was a constructed image. He was the perfect son, the war hero, the family man. He lived under the microscope of his father's ambition and the public's adoration. In the bedroom, he needed a different kind of control. The boots were a symbol of artifice. He didn't want the natural woman, he wanted the performer. He wanted the Blaze Starr persona, not Fanny Bell Fleming. The boots created a boundary, a reminder that this was a scene being directed, not a moment of intimacy. Blaze later said he was a back man. He had a bad back, but he worked around it. Even in her candor, she highlighted his fragility. The golden boy was physically broken, held together by cortisone shots and painkillers, seeking relief in the arms of a woman who asked for nothing but discretion. There is one infamous legend in the Blaze Starr canon that she swore to until her dying day. It is a tableau of American history so absurd, so tawdry, that it feels like a hallucination, yet it remains an essential part of her lore. The setting, the show bar in New Orleans. The players, Blaze Starr, Senator John F. Kennedy, and the Senate Majority Leader, Lyndon Baines Johnson. JFK and LBJ were in town, ostensibly on political business. They ended up at the club to see Blaze perform. After the show, the three of them were backstage. The dressing room was tiny, cluttered with costumes and smelling of makeup powder. According to Blaze, the chemistry with Kennedy was immediate. They needed a moment alone, but the show bar was packed. There was no privacy. So, the future 35th President of the United States pulled the Queen of Burlesque into a cramped storage closet. And who stood guard? Who made sure no nosy reporter or stagehand opened the door? Lyndon Baines Johnson. The future 36th President, a man who would pass the Civil Rights Act and escalate the Vietnam War, was reduced to playing the lookout, leaning his massive frame against the door, while his rival-turned-ally had a quick tryst among the mops and buckets. When they emerged, Kennedy straightened his tie, flashed that million-dollar smile, and reportedly said to Blaze, "Winning your body is much harder than any election I have ever entered." It was a line, a scripted, perfect line. Kennedy was always on stage. Even after sex in a closet, he was campaigning. Blaze noticed something else in that moment. She noticed the tension between the two men. Johnson loathed Kennedy's ease, his wealth, his popularity. Kennedy viewed Johnson as a useful brute, and yet here they were, bound together by the secret brotherhood of vice. They covered for each other. It was the gentleman's agreement in its purest, rawest form. The affair continued even after Kennedy entered the White House, but the tone changed. The stakes were higher. Blaze recalled a specific conversation that highlights Kennedy's terrifying ability to compartmentalize, to separate his emotions from his intellect completely. It was after a tryst. Most men would be relaxed, perhaps sleepy. Kennedy was wide awake. He turned to Blaze and asked, with genuine clinical curiosity, "How can you stand that crazy old bastard Earl Long?" He wasn't jealous. He was studying Earl. He was trying to understand the populism that Earl represented, the raw emotional connection Earl had with voters, a connection Kennedy struggled to replicate. He was debriefing her. Blaze realized then that she was a source of information as much as a source of pleasure. But the most chilling moment came in October 1962. The world was holding its breath. Soviet missiles were in Cuba. American warships were enforcing a blockade. Nuclear war seemed inevitable. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the most dangerous moment in human history. In the middle of this global nightmare, Blaze Starr's phone rang. It was the president. He sounded tired, but calm. They spoke briefly, and then, facing the potential end of civilization, Kennedy made a joke. "If Castro had someone like you to come home to," he told the stripper, "he'd think more about making love than making war." Whether this call was a literal event or a conflated memory of a terrified nation, Blaze's retelling captures the surreal absurdity of the era. The man with his finger on the button was flirting with a burlesque dancer while the silos were opening. Blaze hung up the phone terrified, not just of the bombs, but of the coldness. She realized that the men running the world were not gods. They were bored, distracted, horny, and terrifyingly human. They played with nations the way they played with women, with a mix of fascination and detachment. The affair fizzled out naturally. The risks became too great, the security too tight. And then came Dallas, November the 22nd, 1963. When Kennedy was killed, the era of the gentleman's agreement died with him, though it would take a few years to fully rot away. The silence that had protected his private life began to crack. Blaze watched the funeral on television, just as she had watched Earl's. Once again, she was the invisible mourner. She saw Jackie Kennedy in her veil, the grieving queen. Blaze felt a strange kinship with the First Lady. Both of them had been props in Jack's great play. Both of them used to maintain the image of Camelot, though from very different sides of the curtain. Blaze was now in her early 30s. She had buried a governor and mourned a president. She had been at the absolute center of the American century. But unlike Marilyn Monroe, who was crushed by the weight of the men who used her, or Judy Garland, who was consumed by the industry, Blaze Starr did not break. The survival instinct that drove her out of the West Virginia hollow kicked in. She looked around the 2 o'clock club. She looked at the younger girls coming up, desperate for fame. She looked at the changing culture of the 60s. The sexual revolution that was making burlesque seemed quaint and outdated. She realized the party was ending. It was time to secure her future. She wasn't going to end up a tragedy. She was going to end up a legend. The gunshots in Dallas did more than kill a president. They signaled the violent end of an era. The cool of the 1950s, the Rat Pack elegance, the martini lunches, the silent agreements, shattered into the chaos of the late 1960s. The country was burning. Cities were rioting. The sexual revolution was stripping away the mystery that burlesque relied upon. Blaze Starr stood at the center of her stage at the 2 o'clock club, watching the world change through the haze of cigarette smoke. She was now in her 30s. In the brutal calculus of the sex industry, she should have been finished. A stripper's career is measured in dog years. By 30, you are expected to vanish. But Fannie Belle Fleming had not survived the coal mines of West Virginia to be discarded because the calendar turned a page. She did not fade, she calcified. She turned herself from a performer into an institution and then into a tycoon. The cultural shift of the late 1960s and early 70s was a disaster for traditional burlesque. The tease was replaced by the show. Laws were relaxing. Pornography was moving from the back alley to the mainstream. Deep Throat was playing in theaters. Men no longer wanted the slow, tantalizing reveal of a glove or a stocking. They wanted immediate graphic gratification. The block in Baltimore grew darker. The glamorous gangsters and slumming politicians were replaced by drug dealers and desperate addicts. The neon lights that once promised excitement now just illuminated the grime. Blaze saw this coming before anyone else. She realized that she could no longer compete on mere nudity. Any girl in 1970 could do that. She had to compete on legend. She stopped being just a dancer and became the queen. She leaned into her history. She wasn't just a body on stage. She was the woman who had slept with the president. She was the woman who had tamed Earl Long. She turned her past into a commodity. By the mid-1970s, the silence of the gentleman's agreement was dead. Watergate had happened. Americans no longer trusted their leaders. The press was hungry for dirt. Publishers began circling Blaze. They wanted the sleaze. They wanted the dirty details of JFK and Earl Long. They wanted to turn her into a caricature. Blaze, shrewd as ever, decided to beat them to the punch. If anyone was going to cash in on her life, it was going to be her. In 1974, she published her memoir, Blaze Starr, My Life as Told to Huey Perry. It was a bombshell, but it wasn't the trashy tell-all people expected. It was surprisingly warm, funny, and human. She didn't paint herself as a victim of powerful men. She painted herself as an adventurer who had gone toe-to-toe with them. She wrote about Earl Long not as a corrupt monster, but as a tragic, lovable eccentric. She wrote about JFK with a mix of reverence and pity. The book changed the public perception of her. She ceased to be a fallen woman and became a folk hero. She was the American dream turned inside out. The poor girl who conquered the rich men, took their money, kept her boots on, and lived to tell the tale. The ultimate vindication came in the late 1980s. Hollywood decided that the story of the governor and the stripper was the stuff of cinema. But this wasn't a B-movie production. This was a major studio film titled simply Blaze. The director was Ron Shelton, fresh off the success of Bull Durham. And playing Earl Long, it was Paul Newman, the blue-eyed legend of the silver screen. To play Blaze, they cast Lolita Davidovich. But the real star was on the sidelines. Blaze Starr was hired as a consultant. She was on set every day. Imagine the scene. The real Blaze Starr, now in her late 50s, sitting in a director's chair, instructing Paul Newman on how to act like her dead lover. She taught him Earl's mannerisms, the way he chewed his cigar, the way he shuffled his feet, the way he exploded in laughter. There is a profound irony here. The establishment that had once sneered at her, the polite society that had called her a whore, was now rolling out the red carpet. She attended the premiere in a gown that cost more than her father had earned in his entire life. She walked the red carpet not as a scandalous appendage to a man, but as the subject of the story. The movie cemented her legacy. It froze her in time as the vibrant, red-headed siren. It ensured that when people remembered Earl Long, they would have to remember Blaze Starr. She had effectively written herself into the history books. As the 1990s approached, Blaze made another pivot, perhaps the most symbolic of her life. She retired from the nightclub business. She sold the deuce. The era was over, and she knew when to exit the stage. But she didn't retire to a rocking chair. She went back to the earth. Throughout her life, Blaze had been showered with jewelry, baubles, trinkets, engagement rings from men who had no intention of marrying her. She had learned to look at a diamond and judge its worth instantly. She knew that men lied, politicians lied, and even mirrors lied eventually. But a diamond? A diamond was the truth. It was carbon and pressure. It was permanent. She became a certified gemologist. She began designing high-end jewelry, but these weren't delicate trinkets. When experts later examined her personal collection, they noticed a telling detail. The settings were heavy, the prongs were thick, and the metal was substantial. These weren't delicate baubles. They were built to endure. They were armor. There is a poetic symmetry to this. She began in the coal mine, surrounded by black carbon. She ended her life surrounded by crystallized carbon, diamonds. She had refined herself just as the earth refines coal. She had taken the crushing pressure of her life, the poverty, the judgment, the scandals, and used it to harden herself into something unbreakable and brilliant. In her final years, the city of Baltimore, which had once tried to shut her down, embraced her as a local treasure. She was a quirky aunt to the city, but the mountains were calling. Blaze Starr never really left Wilsondale in her heart. The hillbilly identity that she had hidden under feathers and sequins became her comfort in old age. She moved back to West Virginia. She bought a sprawling estate, not a shack. She lived surrounded by the woods that had once terrified her with their silence. She died on June 15, 2015, at the age of 83. Her funeral was not the shameful burial of a sinner. It was a celebration. It was covered by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the BBC. So, what are we to make of Fannie Bell Fleming? If you look at the official history books, you will see the sanitization we spoke of in the beginning. You will read about the legislative achievements of Earl Long and the foreign policy of JFK. Blaise Starr is usually relegated to a footnote, a piece of trivia. But this is a mistake. Blaise Starr is not the trivia. She is the text. She is the key to understanding the reality of the American century. She represents the ID of the nation, the desires, the messiness, and the raw hunger that existed beneath the gray flannel suits. She proved that power is not just about laws and armies. Power is also about desire. The men who thought they ruled the world, Earl Long, JFK, Sam Giancana, were all in the end ruled by their own needs. And Blaise was the woman who understood those needs better than they did themselves. She was a black box recorder for the mid-20th century. She was in the room when the decisions were made, not taking notes, but taking the measure of the men making them. From a dirt floor in Appalachia to the secret closet of the show bar with a president, her journey was an impossible trajectory. She was the girl who walked into the fire and didn't burn. She simply absorbed the heat and reflected it back at a world that was too afraid to touch her. She was Blaise Starr. And in a world of gray men, she was the only one in Technicolor.